Hi, welcome to Smartorial. Today we're going to learn how to render a brown leather wallet with Chartpak markers. This tutorial will teach you how to be confident with them, blend different values together, and use colored pencil to highlight certain areas. This is what our final goal should look like. But before we begin, I'd like you to draw a rectangle, 103mm times 77mm. I've laid out the initial browns that we will use, and we will work it from light to dark and some back and forth in between. Right now what I'm doing here is outlining the interior of the wallet. This is so that I can start filling it in. I don't go outside the lines. The thick outlines give me a margin of error. I want you to notice on the right hand side I've numbered the markers from 1 to 4, 1 being the lightest and 4 being the darkest. We will work from light to dark and then back and forth to smooth out the transitions. Right now, I'm giving 2 coats of sand color, the number 1 marker. The Beanfang 360 paper is really absorbent, but after it gets primed with the first layer, we will need a second. This is to help smooth out the marker lines and allow us to have a better color transition. I'm going to go over to a darker color now. And as the paper is still wet with the marker, I'm going to go to a Kraft Brown. Down in the lower right hand corner of the screen, you will see what marker or tool I'm using for each stroke. This is so that you can pause and follow along at any time and know exactly what tool I'll be using. Right now I'm making the right hand side darker than the left. I've decided that the left hand side is where the light is going to come from. Right now I'm going to mark in a small shadow area that sits along the left spine of the wallet. And I'm going to use a Kraft Brown for that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to blend it in as best as possible. But I'm going to keep the left hand side a highlight. Right now I'm using a blender to blend in that harsh line on the spine. Right now I'm using a sepia to even add more contrast to the right hand side of the wallet. Now I want you to know something about blending. Whatever the color of your object is, the lightest shade will be able to turn into your blender. As you go darker and darker for more contrast, you will be able to use the lightest marker value as a blender. This is important because if you use a colorless blender in very dark areas, what can actually happen is you pick up the color and you might ruin your drawing. You might make someplace very light when you didn't mean to. But if you use a light colored marker and not a blender, you will not be taking any color away unintentionally. Right now I'm darkening the edges with burnt umber for more contrast, just slightly though. I went back to a sepia tone to blend it in. Oftentimes, layering the same color on top of each other will yield darker shades, and that's what I'm doing right now. I'm layering sepia on top of dried sepia color, and I'm just going around the edges to add more contrast. I've picked up my burnt umber marker again, and I'm just going to go over the edges, just over the edges for more contrast, because to me in a wallet, it's usually at the edges that are a lot darker than the top, because the top is dome shaped and it's catching a lot of light. Now one thing I want to do right now is I want to make it even darker, a little bit more contrast. So I'm going over the wallet again with sepia. I have waited for the sepia underneath to dry. And what I've done in this video is I've edited out the gaps. But you should know that if you keep working wet on wet, it's going to blend a little bit too smoothly. You might want to make sure that you wait till it dries before you layer on another color. Right now I'm using a colorless blender to just blend in that harsh line between the highlight and the core of the shadow on the spine. This is important to me. And then I continue putting sepia on top of everything. At this point, the paper is getting very saturated, and it has a lot of layers of marker, and sometimes it can get a little bit too sticky, and it won't blend as well anymore. You gotta be careful not to overwork this paper that much. And what I'm doing now is I'm using sand to blend the rest of it. Not the blender, but sand. Now, wait for 10 minutes for this to dry before we move on to the next step. After you've let the marker dry, we're going to draw the monogram for the wallet. I've printed out the letter M and I've slid it underneath the marker paper. Because the marker paper is slightly translucent, I'll be able to see the letter and trace the outline. You can use any letter you want, one that represents your name, or even like a symbol or anything you want, whatever logo. And now I just use a straight edge to follow the outlines of the letter M. And I'm using a black Verithin pencil. Now I'm going to use burnt umber to fill in the space inside the M. Now I chose burnt umber because my wallet's brown, and I used sand as the base color because burnt umber is the darkest brown I have, and it's a number 4 on the list. I'm going to use it so that when I fill in the interior space in the M, it's going to set it deeper because all embossed details are set further back in space and it won't catch as much light. And so if I colored it in, automatically it'll look like it sits deeper in space. Welcome to the final part of the wallet tutorial. Now I'm going to use a straight edge to draw in the stitches that surround the wallet. I'm using a Prismacolor Cool Gray 80%. Using this different type of marker is advantageous at this stage because the different type of ink won't really mix with the Chartpak solvent. Prismacolors are alcohol based and Chartpak markers are xylene based. This line doesn't represent the stitches, the one that I'm drawing right now, but it represents the stitch groove that the stitches will sit in. This is pretty critical for me because usually when people draw in stitches to a shoe or clothing or garments, they just start drawing the dashed lines. But if you do this step, the drawing will seem more real because the stitches will sit inside that groove. Next, I take the Premier Fine Line Marker, number 3 width, and then I draw in the stitches themselves. Now, this is just going to be the base color of the stitch. This step will help make the actual stitches seem more substantial and real. Later on in the tutorial, we're going to go over each stitch, each black dash that we're drawing, with a white Prismacolor pencil. The white pencil on top of these stitches will represent the light. Right now I'm darkening the center of the M embossment to make it look deeper. Make sure your marker work is dry before you do this, or else the pencil won't catch on the paper. The tooth will become very slick and your pencil will kind of slide all over the place and look kind of a little mushy. Right now I'm using a Prismacolor Premier Black pencil, the Noir, and it's a softer lead because I want it kind of darker. Right now I'm going to use a black Verithin to darken the spine of the wallet, kind of drawing a little coarse shadow. I chose a black Verithin because the lead is a little stiffer and I wanted a little bit more control of the subtle shading I was going to do. A soft black Prismacolor would have been too soft for me at this point. Right now I'm using the white pencil to add more white to the highlight in the spine area. You must also remember to add highlights to that small sliver of space above the stitch line, because that's part of the wallet too. And then of course definitely shade the body of the wallet with your white pencil. And just highlight the spinal area and make the white parts a little bit whiter. And what I'm doing right now is I'm shading the white pencil in tighter and tighter spots. Because the light is coming up from the upper left hand side, I am just going to concentrate a little bit more on the upper left hand spine of the wallet. And then I'm going to let everything trail off. And even in that small sliver of space below the stitch line, I'm going to highlight. But I'm going to concentrate a lot more shading in the upper left hand corner. And that's going to indicate that the light is closer to the top left, and then I'm just going to let it trail off. Let it trail off. Right now I'm highlighting the far edges that are facing the light in the upper left hand corner. Just a little bit. I'm just going to do a little bit of the edges just to indicate that that area is facing the light in the upper left hand corner. I'm not going to overdo it. I don't want that white part to be as white as the highlight on the left hand spine. So I'm just going to go over it very, very lightly. What I'm doing right now is also putting the highlights to the edges of the embossed M. If the light is coming from the upper top left, the edges in the lower right of the M will get the highlight. Just those edges. Don't overdo it. Don't outline the entire M in white pencil, because then the viewer will totally get confused as to where the light's coming from. The viewer will think, oh, the light's everywhere. But in fact, if you just do the lower right hand edges, then the lighting will be consistent and it will unify the drawing as a whole. So just keep all the highlights to the lower right hand edges. Now, let's start putting white penciling to the highlights to the stitches. This will make each individual black line that you've marked pop. Now, what I want you to do is go over each black stitch a little bit with the white pencil. This should be enough to give it a little bit of depth, like it's catching a little bit of light. After you've done each stitch and drawn in the middle of each black stitch a little white highlight, go back and draw even a tighter white highlight in the center of that white highlight. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Because what's that going to do is it's going to show that the stitches come up out of the wallet. It's going to reach a high point. The light's going to hit the stitch. Then it's going to go down. So each stitch should look a little bit lighter in the center. And I want you to do that for each stitch. You see how all of a sudden these stitches are popping out? They seem more real because one, there's black underneath, that black line. And it's also because it's sitting in a groove. And that adds to the realism of this illustration, of this marker rendering. What we're going to do now is we're going to do some final touch-up details with a black Prismacolor pencil and a white Prismacolor pencil. What I'm doing now is I'm using black and I'm darkening the core shadow on the left-hand side. The left-hand side of the wallet is rounded, and there's going to be a part of it that's going to be facing totally away from the light. It's going to turn away from the light, and it's going to be dark. And what I'm going to do is I want to up the contrast a little bit. Before I used the black Verithin, I didn't know how dark I wanted to go, but now I'm pretty sure I want to go a little bit darker. So I darkened it in. And then I'm going to take a white, and then I'm going to pop out the white highlight. And this is going to help me add a lot more contrast to a very exciting part of the drawing where the light hits it. And I want to keep all that action in the upper left-hand side. It adds realism to the wallet, and it just helps make it read a lot better. To make the drawing pop even more, I am going to surround it with a dark outline. I'm going to start off with a cool gray 5 marker, and I'm just going to surround it. This contrast of a dark background with my wallet, it's going to help it jump off the page. Because right now it's sitting on a white background. That's okay, but I want a black background. And after we're done, you're going to see what a big difference this makes. Also, what this helps does is that when I was using the brown marker, along the edges, I know that there's a little bit of bleeding, a little bit of feathering, because we used so much brown marker. The paper got really saturated. And of course, it's going to have a really fuzzy edge. It's not going to have a fine edge. That's okay, because I knew that in the end, I was going to darken in the surrounding area, and I was going to cover up those little feather fuzzy edges anyway. And that's always something to keep in mind. You can always save a marker rendering and clean up those edges if you put a abstract background in the back, something a little bit darker to cover up your mistakes. And that's okay. It's a little trick I do. After the 5 gray marker, I'm going to go to a cool gray 7 marker. And I'm going to surround it again. I'm going to go from light to dark. After the cool gray 7 marker, I'm going to go to a 9. And I'm going to layer it on. And then after the 9, I'm going to use a 10. Now, I keep it away from black because I feel that black is a little too black. I just want to make it pop, and I don't want to put something as dark as a black in the background. I think it'll just detract from it. Now, some of you may think, or ask yourself, well, why don't you just go straight to a 9 or a 10 and, leave it at that? That's a good question. The reason is you want to lead your eye from light to dark. If you start out with the darkest value in the beginning, there's nowhere to run. You can only go darker. Working from light to dark also lets you be very selective about how you go from light to dark, how you're going to lead them. So right now with the 10, I'm just going to do the lower bottom edge and the right hand edge. It's going to seem like I'm dropping a shadow. And that's because I knew way beforehand I didn't want to get way too dark. So keep that in mind. Go from light to dark. You don't have to start out with a 1 gray. Know that, well, you're going to get pretty dark, so you can start out with a 5 and go on from there. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you got a little bit more comfortable with layering with markers. I know markers are a little scary because they're so permanent, but with some practice, you will definitely get the hang of it. And thank you for joining us today at smartorial.com, and please join us again next time. We are here to help you get to the next level in your art. Thank you.